Ciao a tutti, io sono Darko e ho visto un po' di persone in attesa di questa call di Powell. Beh, non è una call perché una call vorrebbe dire che io partecipo, in realtà è soltanto una conferenza di Jerome Powell che insomma sarà curioso da sentire. Ovviamente cioè non i minutes. Il comunicato stampa insomma è uscito 26-27 minuti fa e il mercato l'ha presa abbastanza bene inizialmente, poi non ho seguito perché ho provato a fare tutto un po' di fretta, oggi ero abbastanza impegnato, quindi non ho nemmeno cenato, sono in live senza aver cenato. E no, comunque il mercato l'ha presa abbastanza bene, c'è stato uno spike, poi è tutto ritornato sui livelli di oggi. Comunque, beh, facciamo vedere cosa sta facendo il mercato. Insomma, il mercato è decisamente positivo oggi, tutto quanto. E sì, vedete? Beh, immagino mi sentite, e altrimenti avrei avuto un sacco di commenti. Comunque S&P più 1,6, Dow più 1 e Nasdaq più 2,5 e anche il Russell sta facendo bene. Il petrolio oggi, non il crude oil, l'altro, ha toccato i $90, mi pare, perché insomma sta salendo tutto. E vedete alcune azioni, così come sostanzialmente ieri erano tutte a meno 4 nella live che abbiamo fatto con Davide per la trimestrale di Microsoft, oggi sono tutte a più 6, più 10. Ovviamente quelle che erano stabili ieri sono stabili anche oggi, tipo FedEx, Johnson Johnson, eccetera, eccetera. E Amazon ha un pochino recuperato, ovviamente è ancora sotto i 3.000. Comunque stanno recuperando oggi, ma i prezzi sono ancora molto lontani dai massimi, insomma ci sono ancora buoni prezzi, ma oggi è decisamente una giornata positiva, tranne per Alibaba. Non ho seguito cosa sia successo oggi, ma insomma non mi sorprende. E poi vabbè, le altre sono sostanzialmente anche Pins e Matterport un pochino male, ma poi ci sono dei più 7, più 5, più 14, Shift. Vabbè, con un più 14 comunque sotto i 2,5, quindi vale quello che vale. No, comunque tornando a noi, Powell inizia a parlare tra 2 minuti. Io ho già il canale YouTube pronto, insomma condividerò lo schermo. E l'abbiamo fatto come abbiamo fatto settimana scorsa, un mese fa, o più di un mese fa, a metà dicembre. Sostanzialmente condivido, ogni tanto mi soffermo su quello che dice e faccio, un po' traduco, un po' dico la mia, e poi quando passano un po' di minuti che stiamo perdendo la live lo metto a o 1,25 o 1,5, così lo accelero e piano piano lo recuperiamo. Di solito dura poco più di un'ora tutta la live di Powell, quindi noi magari duriamo fino alle 9:40 penso, e poi mi prendo 10 minuti di pausa per cenare. E poi appunto ci sarà anche la live su Tesla, una live separata, la rendo pubblica tra un po', mentre Powell parla, la rendo pubblica così potete vederla. E niente, Powell time, godure a prescindere, vediamo, insomma, io non so cosa aspettarmi. Se i mercati salgono sono contentissimo, perché mi sta bene. Ho comprato non lunedì perché ero fuori casa quando stava crollando tutto, però ho comprato ieri, non ai minimi ovviamente perché è impossibile comprare ai minimi, però ho comprato, sono contento. Se invece continua a crollare, va bene, insomma ho ancora un po' di liquidità da investire. Comunque dicono di ordinare una pizza da Galletti, ma ho paura che se la ordinassi non arriva, conoscendo Galletti. Comunque Powell dovrebbe iniziare a momenti, di solito è puntualissimo. Vediamo se intanto posso condividerlo. Aspetta un attimo. Allora, share, e voglio condividere semplicemente una schermata. Ok.
Good afternoon.
Io sto condividendo.
At the Federal Reserve, we are strongly committed to achieving the monetary policy goals that Congress has given us: maximum employment and price stability. Today, in support of these goals, the Federal Open Market Committee kept its policy interest rate near zero and stated its expectation that an increase in this rate would soon be appropriate. The committee also agreed to continue reducing its net asset purchases on the schedule we announced in December, bringing them to an end in early March. As I will explain, against a backdrop of elevated inflation and a strong labor market, our policy has been adapting to the evolving economic environment, and it will continue to do so. Economic activity expanded at a robust pace last year, reflecting progress on vaccinations and the reopening of the economy. Fiscal and monetary policy support.
Allora, ops, ho sbagliato.
The recent sharp rise in COVID cases associated with the Omicron variant will surely weigh on economic growth this
Adesso va
quarter.
meglio, ho abbassato un po' il suo.
High-frequency indicators
E
point to
adesso
reduced spending in COVID-sensitive
ho
sectors,
alzato anche i
such as
numeri.
travel
Ditemi
and
com'è.
restaurants.
Va meglio.
And activity more broadly may also be
Alzo
affected
ancora il
as
mio.
many
Alzo
workers
ancora
are
il mio.
unable to report for work because of illness, quarantines, or caregiving
Ora?
needs.
Ditemi come va. Comunque
Fortunately,
appunto finché non fanno domande
health
non
experts are
è
finding that the
importante sentirlo
Omicron
perché
variant
tanto
has not been as virulent
sta
as
leggendo quello che
previous
lasciano
strains of the
pubblicato.
virus, and they expect that cases will drop off rapidly. If the wave passes quickly, the economic effects should as well, and we would see a return to strong growth. That said, the implications for the
Proverò
economy
a
remain
guardare
uncertain,
messo dal mio telefono per vedere
and we
come
have
sta.
not lost sight of the fact that for many afflicted individuals and families, and for the healthcare workers on the front lines, the virus continues to cause
Ora ho
great
messo al
hardship.
massimo il mio.
The labor market has made remarkable progress, and by many measures is very strong. Job gains have been solid in recent months, averaging 365,000 per month over the past 3 months. Over the past year, payroll
Prova.
employment has risen by
Dovrebbe
6.4
andare.
million
Se no
jobs.
abbasso ancora il suo.
The unemployment rate has declined sharply, falling 2 percentage points over the past 6 months to reach 3.9% in December. The improvements in labor market conditions have been widespread, including for workers at the lower end of the wage distribution,
Abbasso ancora il
as
suo.
well as
Non
for
si sente.
African Americans and Hispanics. Labor demand remains historically strong. With constraints on labor supply,
Ora?
employers are having difficulties filling job openings,
Ora dovrebbe
and
andare
wages are
meglio,
rising at their
perché l'ho
fastest
abbassato
pace
parecchio.
in
Magari
many
ora non si
years.
sente lui.
While labor force participation has edged up, it remains subdued, in part reflecting the aging of the population and retirements. In addition, some who otherwise would be seeking work report that they are out of the labor
Comunque sì,
force
insomma,
because
stava
of factors
facendo
related to the
il riassunto
pandemic,
della situazione
including
economica, ha
caregiving
parlato
needs and
della,
ongoing concerns about
di
the virus.
come insomma, la popolazione che
current wave
invecchia
of the
vuol dire
virus
meno
may well
popolazione che
prolong
lavora,
these
eccetera,
effects.
eccetera. Insomma,
Over
è la
time,
situazione
there are good
economica
reasons to
attuale
expect
dell'America,
some
che
further
c'è
improvements
inflazione,
in
che i
participation
lavoratori
and
mancano,
employment.
il mercato del lavoro è abbastanza saturo perché
Inflation
mancano,
remains
eccetera,
well
eccetera.
above our
I sottotitoli
longer run
non
goal
so
of
se
2%.
posso perché sono disattivati da loro.
Supply and demand
Vedi,
imbalances related to
sottotitoli
the
non
pandemic
disponibili.
and the reopening of the economy have continued to contribute to elevated levels of inflation. In particular, bottlenecks and supply constraints are limiting how quickly production can respond to higher demand in the near term. These problems have been larger and longer lasting than anticipated,
Ecco,
exacerbated by
sostanzialmente di
waves of the
nuovo
virus.
inflazione alta
While
più
the
di
drivers of higher
quanto si
inflation
pensava,
have been
eccetera, eccetera.
predominantly connected to the dislocations caused by the pandemic, price increases have now spread to a broader range of goods and services. Wages have also risen briskly, and we are attentive to the risks that persistent real wage growth in excess of productivity could put upward pressure on inflation.
Ecco qua.
Like
Pressione
most forecasters,
sull'inflazione.
we continue to expect inflation to decline over the course of the year.
Comunque
We
le domande
understand that high
rispondo dopo.
inflation imposes significant hardship, especially on those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. In addition, we believe that the best thing we can do to support continued labor market gains is to promote a long expansion, and that will require price stability.
Questa è una frase importante, long expansion, cioè vuol dire che loro vogliono che l'economia cresca per molto tempo. Tradotto, non vogliamo recessione, neanche un trimestre. Cioè magari un trimestre sì, però long expansion vuol dire tipo l'ultima, che è durata 12 anni. Cioè non vogliono nessun tipo di recessione, vuol dire crescita del PIL sempre positiva. Magari un trimestre fa più 1 e quello dopo più 0,1, però comunque positiva. E ovviamente dice che per riuscire a arrivare a questo risultato è necessario che i prezzi siano stabili, quindi bisogna abbassare l'inflazione, e ha detto che inizialmente era transitoria, poi si è propagata su molte cose, mentre i salari stanno salendo, ma non tanto quanto l'inflazione. Quindi, insomma, il salario reale sta diminuendo, cioè è diminuito.
We're committed to our price stability goal. We will use our tools both to support the economy and a strong labor market, and to prevent higher inflation from becoming entrenched. And we'll be watching carefully to see whether the economy is evolving in line with expectations. The Fed's monetary policy actions have been guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. As I noted, the committee left the target range for the federal funds rate unchanged and reaffirmed our plan, announced in December, to end asset purchases in early March. In light of the remarkable progress we've seen in the labor market and inflation that is well above our 2% longer run goal, the economy no longer needs sustained high levels of monetary policy support. That is why we are phasing out our asset purchases and why we expect it will soon be appropriate to raise the target range for the federal funds rate.
Ecco qua, ha appena detto quello che appunto sta leggendo di nuovo, quindi non sono ancora novità. Sarà appropriato a breve, soon will be appropriate, di alzare i tassi di interesse. Quindi non oggi, come in realtà altamente previsto, e ha detto stiamo finendo cioè il tapering, insomma, è ancora in corso, stiamo ancora acquistando asset. Tradotto, esattamente ciò che il mercato si aspettava, a marzo finisce il tapering e a marzo annunciano il rialzo dei tassi. Ora la domanda si sposterà, cioè una delle domande che sicuramente gli faranno è: ma pensate di alzare più di un rialzo alla volta o farete 0,25 alla volta?
Of course, the economic outlook remains highly uncertain. Making appropriate monetary policy in this environment requires humility, recognizing that the economy evolves in unexpected ways. We'll need to be nimble so that we can respond to the full range of plausible
devono
outcomes.
essere umili.
With this in mind, we will remain attentive to risks, including the risk that high inflation is more persistent than expected, and are prepared to respond as appropriate to achieve our goals. To provide greater clarity about our approach for reducing the size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, today the
Per me è
Committee
ancora
issued a set of
transitorio.
principles that will provide a foundation
Un
for
anno
our
e mezzo
future
di inflazione
decisions.
è transitorio.
These high-level principles
5 anni non è
clarify that
transitorio.
the federal funds rate is our primary means of adjusting monetary policy, and that reducing our balance sheet will occur after the process of raising interest rates has begun. Reductions will occur over time in a predictable manner, primarily through adjustments to reinvestments, so that securities roll off our balance sheet. Over time, we intend to hold securities in the amounts needed for our ample reserves operating framework, and in the longer run, we envision holding primarily Treasury securities. Our decisions to reduce our balance sheet will be guided by our maximum employment and price stability goals. In that regard, we will be prepared to adjust any of the details of our approach to balance sheet management in light of economic and financial developments. The committee has not made decisions regarding the specific timing, pace, or other details of shrinking the balance sheet, and we will discuss these matters in upcoming meetings and provide additional information at the appropriate time.
Questo è importante, che hanno discusso appunto della riduzione del bilancio Fed, ma non hanno discusso né di quando iniziare né di quanto, con che quantità iniziare. Cioè la Fed ha 7 mila miliardi a bilancio, 8 forse. Insomma, di questo si parlerà più avanti, quindi non darà molte info, e anche questo era un altro dei dubbi, che la Fed possa iniziare a lasciar correre il suo bilancio presto. Non ne hanno ancora parlato, quindi inizieranno a parlarne bene a marzo, quindi è molto 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 improbabile che possano iniziare a diminuire il loro bilancio prima della metà dell'anno, giugno, luglio, agosto forse, quindi anche questa è una buona notizia. Cioè insomma, per ora è esattamente tutto ciò che il mercato si aspettava, del tipo ok, cioè la Fed non ha cambiato idea nelle ultime 2 o 3 settimane, sta mantenendo la sua traiettoria.
To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Federal Reserve will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Ecco le domande. Let's go.
Thank you. For the first question, we'll go to Chris, your neighbor at Defense.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you, Chair Powell. So it's expected that the Fed will hike rates perhaps every other meeting, but certainly in the past, the Fed has hiked at every meeting. So I just wanted to ask, are rate hikes at consecutive meetings on the table? This year, is every meeting a live meeting?
Sostanzialmente negli anni passati la Fed alzava i tassi un meeting sì, uno no, uno sì, uno no. Adesso chiede, è possibile che qua alziate i tassi 2 meeting di fila? C'è un meeting a marzo e un meeting ad aprile, per dire.
And on that note,
Sono 8 meeting all'anno.
would the Fed consider front-loading some of its rate hikes, even if it doesn't raise every meeting?
Oppure farne 2
Thanks.
insieme.
So as I referred to in my opening statement, it is not possible to predict with much confidence exactly what path for our policy rate is going to prove appropriate. And so at this time, we haven't made any decisions about the path of policy. And I stress again that we'll be humble and nimble. We're going to have to navigate currents and actually two-sided risks now. And I'll say also that we're going to be guided by the data. In fact, what I'll say is that we're going to be led by the incoming data and the evolving outlook. We'll try to communicate as clearly as possible, moving steadily and transparently. So, more to your question. We know that the economy is in a very different place than it was when we began raising rates in 2015. Specifically, the economy is now much stronger. The labor market is far stronger. Inflation is running well above our 2% target, much higher than it was at that time. And these differences are likely to have important implications for the appropriate pace of policy adjustments. Beyond that, we haven't made any decisions.
Ma sostanzialmente ha detto che non lo sappiamo, cioè che la Fed si lascerà guidare dai dati, aspetteranno i dati che usciranno fuori, come pensavano tutti, avevo fatto il video settimana scorsa in cui dicevo esattamente questo, e la Fed nell'incontro di marzo aspetterà i dati che usciranno a febbraio e marzo, i dati importanti di inflazione e job open, cioè di lavori, e lì deciderà cosa fare. Però non è stato deciso con che ritmo alzare i tassi. Quindi questo vuol dire che la paura del doppio rialzo tornerà. Cioè adesso se ne va perché la Fed ha fatto quello che si attendeva, ma sarà una paura che tornerà prima di marzo, perché non si sa. A marzo potrebbe dire di farne due, potrebbe dire uno a marzo e uno ad aprile, potrebbe farne solo uno a marzo e poi passare direttamente a maggio o giugno, non so quando è quella dopo. Quindi questa incertezza resta, al momento sparisce, ma è soltanto tipo rimandata in avanti, è un'incertezza che tornerà.
Thank you. Let's go to Victoria Guida at Politico.
Hi, Chair Powell. I wanted to ask, you were talking about the health of the labor market, and I'm curious whether you would characterize where we're at right now as maximum employment, and also along those same lines, obviously rate hikes on the table this year. Do you think that the Fed can raise rates, bring inflation under control without hurting jobs and wages?
Bella domanda anche questa.
So I'm just getting both parts of your question written down.
Vabbè, dopo rispondo.
So I would say, and this view is widely held in the committee, that both sides of the mandate are calling for us to move steadily away from the very highly accommodative policies we put in place during the challenging economic conditions that the economy faced earlier in the pandemic. And I would say that most FOMC participants agree that labor market conditions are consistent with maximum employment in the sense of the highest level of employment that is consistent with price stability.
Maximum employment raggiunto, cioè massima occupazione possibile per il livello dell'economia.
And that is my personal view.
E anche lui la pensa così.
And again, very broad support on the committee for the judgment that it will soon be appropriate to raise the target range for the federal funds rate. The other thing is maximum employment will evolve over time and through the course of the business cycle. In the particular situation we're in now, it may well increase. The level of maximum of employment that's consistent with stable prices may increase, and we hope that it will as more people come back into the labor market, as participation gradually rises.
Sostanzialmente il maximum employment è una cosa variabile perché dipende dalla situazione economica. Adesso è stato raggiunto, ma il livello di massima occupazione, cioè quante persone al massimo lavorano contemporaneamente, può aumentare col passare del tempo perché aumenta la job participation, che è quello il grosso problema degli Stati Uniti. Perché? Perché la popolazione invecchia e si sentono più ricchi e non vogliono tornare al lavoro, magari ce ne va uno rispetto a due.
And the policy path that we're broadly contemplating would be supportive of that outcome as well. So the thing about the labor market right now is that there are many millions of more job openings than there are unemployed people. So you ask whether we can raise rates and move to less accommodative and even tight financial conditions without hurting the labor market. I think there's quite a bit of room to raise interest rates without threatening the labor market. This is, by so many measures, a historically tight labor market. Record levels of job openings, of quits. Wages are moving up at the highest pace they have in decades. If you look at surveys of workers, they find jobs plentiful. Look at surveys of companies, they find workers scarce. And all of those readings are at levels really that we haven't seen in a long time, and in some cases ever. So this is a very, very strong labor market, and my strong sense is that we can move rates up without having to severely undermine it. I also would point out that there are other forces at work this year which should also help bring down inflation. We hope, including improvement on the supply side, which will ultimately come the timing and pace of that are uncertain. And also, fiscal policy is going to be less supportive of growth this year, not of the level of economic activity, but the fiscal impulse to growth will be significantly lower. So there are multiple forces which should be working over the course of the year for inflation to come down. We do realize that the timing and pace of that are highly uncertain, and that inflation has persisted longer than we thought. And of course, we're prepared to use our tools to assure that higher inflation does not become entrenched.
Ma questo è importante, cioè la domanda era, pensi che possiate alzare i tassi di interesse senza distruggere il mercato del lavoro? E lui ha detto, sì, abbiamo molto spazio per alzare i tassi di interesse. Cioè non ha detto possiamo alzarli leggermente, ha proprio detto abbiamo molto spazio per alzare i tassi di interesse. E perché? Perché lui è confident sul fatto che il mercato del lavoro è forte. Ci sono molte più job openings, cioè aperture di nuovi posti di lavoro rispetto alla gente che cerca lavoro, i prezzi, cioè gli stipendi stanno salendo abbastanza in fretta e ci sono alcune indicazioni, cioè che questo è, secondo alcune statistiche, è anche uno dei mercati del lavoro più stringenti, cioè più stretti, con meno persone alla ricerca di lavoro di sempre, insomma. E quindi lui pensa che ci sia molto spazio per alzare i tassi di interesse, non sanno quando e come, questo sarà ancora da vedere durante l'anno, perché si baseranno sui dati e questa è una cosa che può evolvere. Comunque pensa di riuscire a mantenere sotto controllo l'inflazione, ma è un'inflazione che si è rivelata più persistent di quanto inizialmente pensavano.
Thank you. Let's go to Nick.
Nasdaq più 0,9, ancora più.
Good afternoon, Jerome Powell. Nick Timmerhouse at the Wall Street Journal. I have a couple of questions on the balance sheet. The statement on the balance sheet today calls for significantly reducing your holdings. What does that mean? And then, apart from moving sooner and faster to shrink the holdings, are there any other ways in which you and your colleagues are seriously thinking about recalibrating this process? And finally, how much disagreement is there around how you should use this tool, including active sales rather than passive sales, or changes in the composition of reinvestments? Thank you.
So I'm afraid to tell you that those are all great questions, and they're questions that the committee is just turning to now. So we had a discussion, as you know, at the last meeting, an introductory discussion of the balance sheet and a teeing up of the issues. At this meeting, we've
Grazie, Filippo.
gone through and carefully put together a set of principles at a high
questo.
level, and those are meant to guide the actual decisions we'll make about the pace and about all of the questions that
Verissimo.
you're asking. And I expect that this process will be something that we spend time on in coming meetings. I can't tell you how many, I can't tell you how long it will take, but and then, you know, at the appropriate
Continua a dire
time,
che
we'll
non lo
provide
sa.
additional information.
Giustamente.
So I did, the last cycle when we went through balance sheet issues, we did find that over the course of 2 or 3 meetings, for example, we did come to interesting and better answers, we thought. So we're just in that process now, and at the next meeting we'll be turning to, you know, more of the details that you're asking about.
Nel prossimo incontro parleranno molto di più dei dettagli della riduzione del bilancio. Come appunto
I would say this: the balance sheet is much bigger. It has a shorter duration than the last time, and the economy is much stronger, and inflation is much higher. So, and I think that leads you to, and I've said this, being willing to move sooner than we did in the last time, and also perhaps faster. But beyond that, it's really not appropriate for me to speculate exactly what that would be. But I would point you to principle number 1, which is the committee views changes in the target rate for the federal funds rate as its primary means of adjusting the stance of monetary policy. So we do want the federal funds rate, we want to operationalize that, and we want the balance sheet to be declining in a predictable manner, and we want it to be declining primarily by adjusting reinvestments.
So if I could follow on that.
Ma sostanzialmente ha detto il bilancio è molto più grosso, l'inflazione è molto più alta e il mercato e l'economia è molto più forte. Tradotto, quando dovremo sganciare il nostro bilancio lo faremo molto più velocemente rispetto a quanto l'abbiamo fatto nel 2018. Vabbè, come previsto, però è una cosa che sicuramente ai mercati non piace. Fate conto però che oltre 1.000 miliardi non ci sarà, cioè il mercato non li sentirà perché sono ancora sotto forma di depositi presso la Fed. Quindi quando toglie 1 miliardo semplicemente toglie quei depositi. E dopo il primo miliardo, dopo 1.000 miliardi, dopo il primo $1 trillion che si iniziano a sentire effetti sul mercato. Ma comunque se lo fa abbastanza in fretta, insomma siamo lì, potrebbe fare oltre 100 miliardi al mese.
Raising rates and reducing the balance sheet both restrain the economy, both tighten monetary policy. How should we think about the relationship between the two? For example, how much passive runoff is equal to every quarter percentage point increase in your benchmark
Bella
rate?
domanda, tecnica.
So again, we think of the balance sheet as
non ha risposto.
moving in a predictable manner, sort of in the background, and that the active tool meeting to meeting is not both of them, it's the federal funds rate. There are rules of thumbs, I'm reluctant to land on one of them that equate this, and there's also an element of uncertainty around the balance sheet. I think we have a much better sense, frankly, of how rate increases affect financial conditions and hence economic conditions. Balance sheet is still a relatively new thing for the markets and for us, so we're less certain about that. So again, I think the pattern we'll follow is to arrive at a timing and a pace and composition and all those things, and then announce that with advance notice, and it will start in the background, and then we'll look to have that just running in the background and have the interest rates again be the active tool of monetary policy. That's at least the plan. I can't tell you much more about any of the very good issues about size, pace, composition, those sorts of things. And we'll be turning to all of those at coming meetings.
Sostanzialmente gli ha chiesto come relazionare l'incremento dei tassi di interesse e il shrinkage del bilancio, cioè riduzione del bilancio, e la risposta è non lo sappiamo. c'è una rule of thumb, c'è una regola generale che possono usare, ma di cui non vuole parlare, ma il punto è che il fatto di avere un bilancio Fed è una cosa relativamente nuova perché è iniziata col quantitative easing, che è diventato importante post 2009, quindi 2008. Quindi abbiamo 13 anni di storia su come funziona il bilancio Fed, mentre su come funziona il rialzo dei tassi di interesse sull'economia abbiamo oltre 100 anni, e quindi sanno gli effetti che provoca il rialzo dei tassi di interesse. Meno sicuro è l'effetto che provoca la riduzione del bilancio, ed è un'altra paura del mercato, cioè che cosa succede se la Fed drena troppa liquidità? Boh, perché non l'ha mai fatto, non si sa, non c'è un precedente storico. Così come non c'era un precedente storico della liquidità immessa per il Covid.
Now we'll go to Neil Irwin.
Thank you, Chair Powell. It's Neil Irwin from Axios. Glad to be back. Sir, I was wondering if the volatility we've seen in financial markets in the last few weeks strikes you as anything alarming or that might affect the trajectory of policy. Conversely, to the degree that financial conditions have tightened some, might that be desirable in some ways in achieving your tightening goals?
So, as you know, the ultimate focus that we have is on the real economy, maximum employment and price stability, and financial conditions matter to the extent that they have implications for achieving the dual mandate. And you also know that we look at broader financial conditions, not one or two things, one or two markets. And what we're always asking ourselves is, are we seeing changes that are both persistent and material enough that of a change in financial conditions that they are inconsistent with the achievement of our goals? So that's how we're looking at that. And I don't want to comment on today's financial conditions broadly, but we're not looking at any one market or so. So that's how we're thinking. In terms of what we've seen, I would say this. We said at our last meeting, we published a summary of economic projections, the median participant expected 3 rate increases this year. And, it's 6 weeks, 7 weeks later now. And you have seen that our communication channel with the markets is working. Markets are now pricing in a number of rate increases. Surveys show that market participants are expecting a balance sheet runoff to begin at the appropriate time, sometime later this year, perhaps. We haven't made that decision yet. So we feel like the communications we have with market participants and with the general public are working, and that the financial conditions are reflecting in advance the decisions that we make. And monetary policy works significantly through expectations. So that in and of itself is appropriate.
Ha detto che è molto importante, cioè le monetary policy, le politiche monetarie funzionano quando si traducono in aspettazione non è una parola che esiste, però insomma avete capito. E, insomma, le loro politiche di rialzo dei tassi funzionano se la gente crede al rialzo dei tassi. Cioè, se loro pensano di fare 3 rialzi dei tassi e la gente dice non faranno nessun rialzo dei tassi, allora è una politica che non funziona. Se loro dicono ok, faremo 3 rialzi dei tassi, la gente dice ok, 3 sicuri, ma forse 4 o forse addirittura 5. Quindi iniziano a essere utili. Cioè la politica monetaria è anche fatta dalla psicologia delle persone. È una cosa molto importante.
Thank you. Let's go to Howard Schneider.
For a year, hi, thanks, Chair Powell, Howard Schneider with Reuters. So for a year now, the statements reference the benchmarks for this initial interest rate increase. Now that we're approaching that moment, what are the benchmarks going to be for subsequent rate increases? I know you can't stipulate the path, but how should we think about the criteria for the next step and the next step?
Well, you're right. We haven't gotten to that point yet. We haven't made a decision yet, and we'll make that decision at the March meeting. We'll make a decision whether to raise the federal funds rate. I would say that the committee is of a mind to raise the federal funds rate at the March meeting, assuming that conditions are appropriate for doing so. We have our eyes on the risks, particularly around the world, but we do expect some softening in the economy from Omicron, but we think that should be temporary, and we think that the underlying strength of the economy should show through fairly quickly after that.
Vabbè, if I could follow,
domanda vuota.
Just a
Vediamo.
related question. The December SEPs had this copacetic sort of set of circumstances where inflation comes down without the federal funds rate ever getting over the estimate of neutral. Given developments since then, do you still think that's a credible narrative for the ultimate path of policy?
My path is highly uncertain, and that we're committed to using our tools to make sure that inflation, high inflation that we're seeing, does not become entrenched. So a number of factors would be, it's not just monetary policy. A number of factors are supporting a decline in inflation, as I mentioned. Fiscal policy will providing significantly less of an impulse to growth. We do expect this year, although we do expect now that it will come slower than we had expected and hoped, that there will be relief on the supply side. So that too should lower these supply side barriers, which are a big part of the story why inflation is high. In addition, monetary policy will be becoming significantly less accommodative. So the question is, we'll be asking this question all year long, and that will be, are things turning out as we expect? There's a case that for whatever reason, the economy slows more and inflation slows more than expected, we'll react to that. If instead we see inflation at a higher level or more persistent level, then we'll react to that. And again, we're well aware that this is a different economy than existed during the last tightening cycle, and our policy is going to reflect those differences.
Sostanzialmente ha detto che vediamo come va, hanno diversi casi che possono rivelarsi tali durante l'anno. Ad esempio, se vedono che l'economia in realtà sta rallentando più del dovuto e se l'inflazione sta rallentando più del dovuto, si adegueranno, cioè vuol dire faranno meno rialzi. Se invece l'economia continua a essere super forte e l'inflazione continua a non calmarsi, faranno più di i 3 rialzi, insomma, continueranno ad adattarsi durante tutto l'anno. Lui ha detto: mi aspetto che questa domanda mi venga fatta per tutto l'anno. E quindi si adatteranno ai dati che usciranno fuori, a quanto forte è l'economia, a come andrà a evolversi l'inflazione, e ha detto appunto che si aspetta, come io, come tutto il mondo, che la supply chain migliorerà durante l'anno, le politiche fiscali americane, cioè i soldi che ti regalano nel conto corrente, non esisteranno più perché Biden non riuscirà a farle passare, è praticamente impossibile che riesca a fare altri piani super miliardari, e quindi non avendo più stimulus check che ti arrivano sul conto, con la supply chain che tende a migliorare e con la Fed che comunque alzerà i tassi, si aspetta che l'inflazione torni assolutamente sotto controllo durante l'anno.
Thank you. Let's go to Gina Smialik. Let's go to Gina.
Di solito gli fanno sempre la domanda sulle cripto, cioè sulle stablecoin.
Okay, let's go to Steve Leisman.
Una è morta. Ops. YouTube non ho detto quella parola che tu
Thank
hai.
you, Mr. Clinton. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sei solo scollegato.
One sort of technical question and one question on principle. The technical question is, if you're going to discuss balance sheet at next upcoming meetings and you won't begin balance sheet reduction until after you begin rate hikes, it seems to technically mean that you won't or can't begin balance sheet reduction until the summer. Is that correct? That's the first thing. Second of all, you suggested that with balance sheet running in the background, that you would possibly be raising rates and running off the balance sheet at the same time. That's sort of a technical question. Part of it. The principal question I have is, you said it's going to be running in the background, but the statement on the balance sheet principle says the committee is prepared to adjust any of the details of its approach based on economic and financial developments, which suggests there's something of a reaction function associated to the balance sheet. Could you give us any sense of the discussion or staff presentation on what is the reaction function surrounding the balance sheet? Thanks.
Gli ha chiesto se, considerando ciò che ha detto, quindi vuol dire che il bilancio, cioè non inizieranno a ridurre il bilancio prima dell'estate, e sempre secondo le parole che ha detto, questo vuol dire che potrebbero alzare i tassi e ridurre il bilancio contemporaneamente, cosa che mi aspetto ovviamente.
So let me start by talking about that last paragraph. So you'll remember during the last cycle that this process of building up and then shrinking the balance sheet is a complicated one, and it involves inevitably surprises. And so during the prior cycle, we amended our balance sheet principles a number of times. Now, we didn't intend to do that. Events required us to do so. So we got a pretty robust paragraph there that says we're free to do this at any time. And it doesn't mean we're going to, but if the situation turns out to be different than we had thought, we're not going to stick with something that isn't working. That's all that's saying. It's meant to be quite a general statement rather than a hint. So, I mean, I like to think that our philosophy of the balance sheet is embodied in these principles. So, the idea that, for example, the federal funds rate is the primary means of adjusting the stance of policy, that will determine the timing and pace of reducing the size of the balance sheet to foster the dual mandate, that will begin to reduce the size after we begin the process of raising rates, and on like that. I mean, those are all the things that try to describe how we will proceed. But it may be at a higher level, to try to get at your question. Asset purchases were enormously important at the beginning of the recovery in terms of restoring market function, as they were right after in the critical phase of the global financial crisis. And then after, they were a macroeconomic tool to support demand. And now the economy no longer needs this highly accommodative policy that we put in place. So
sta spiegando un po' di macroeconomia
stop
in
asset
generale.
purchases first, and then at the appropriate time, start to shrink the balance sheet. Now, the balance sheet is substantially larger than it needs to be. We've identified the end state as amounts needed to implement monetary policy efficiently, effectively in the ample reserve regime. So there's a substantial amount of shrinkage in the balance sheet to be done. That's going to take some time. We want that process to be orderly and predictable. And so those are some of the ways I would think this lays out our the way we're thinking about this. In terms of the timing, I can't really help you. It just says after we get underway. So I would say we're going to have another discussion at the next meeting, and my guess is we'll have at least one other discussion at the meeting after that. And we'll tell you as we make progress, and we'll start the process of allowing runoff and shrinking the balance sheet what we find to be the appropriate time. I wish I could say more, but honestly, we haven't made those decisions, and we actually haven't even really had the important discussions on a lot of the details that we will have at coming meetings.
Ok, allora, partiamo dalle buone notizie. Le poche che ci sono. Sostanzialmente ha detto che non basterà marzo per decidere la velocità con cui andranno a ridurre il bilancio, perché ha detto più di una, cioè dal prossimo inizieranno a parlare dei dettagli, ma ne servirà più di un meeting per iniziare effettivamente a farlo. Quello che ha detto è che il bilancio è enorme, cioè che è troppo grosso, substantial amount, cioè devono togliere importi significativi dal bilancio. Ed è tanto, cioè adesso appunto hanno il bilancio tra i 7 e gli 8 mila miliardi, non mi ricordo di preciso. Vorrà dire che, cioè se loro hanno fatto un anno e mezzo in cui compravano 120 miliardi all'anno, mi aspetto minimo un altro anno e mezzo in cui tolgano 100 miliardi all'anno, se non anche 2. Però sarà da vedere, cioè è una roba che potrebbe continuare a ridurre il bilancio fino al 2023-2024 se l'economia regge, ovviamente. Se succede un'altra recessione, un'altra cosa nel frattempo, lì sono ancora più problemi. Che però, cioè, per i mercati farà male, però oggettivamente è la cosa più giusta da fare, cioè la Fed deve abbassare il suo bilancio, perché in questo modo alla prossima recessione ha tutti gli strumenti necessari per riportare sull'economia quando crollerà, perché inevitabilmente prima o poi succederà. Comunque non un'ottima notizia, infatti ai mercati non piace.
Thank you. Let's go to Craig Torres.
Nasdaq è più 0,27, da più 2,5.
Chair Powell, good afternoon, Michelle. Chair Powell, Craig Torres from Bloomberg. Chair Powell, at the beginning of the conversation, you said risks are two-sided. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on what are the risks to the elusive soft landing. Is Fed policy a risk, over tightening, or what are the risks? And then second, Chair Powell, I have a quick administrative question. Robert Kaplan's disclosure of his securities transactions. In a couple of months, Chair Powell, or maybe sooner, you and I will file our tax returns and we'll list transactions and all kinds of things. And next to those transactions, we'll put dates. And Bloomberg asked for the dates of Mr. Kaplan's transactions. The Dallas Fed is not giving us the dates. And I don't see why this is a matter for the Inspector General or anybody else. I mean, why can't he give us the dates? Will you help us get the dates of those transactions? Thanks.
So, you asked about the risks first. One risk is that inflation risks are still to the upside in the views of most FOMC participants, and certainly in my view as well. There's a risk that the high inflation we're seeing will be prolonged. There's a risk that it will move even higher. And we don't think that's the base case, but you ask what the risks are. And we have to be in a position with our monetary policy to address all of the plausible outcomes. And that calls for us to be in position. We have an expectation about the way the economy is going to be evolved, but we've got to be in a position to address different outcomes, including the one where inflation remains higher. And of course, that is a risk to the expansion. We've been saying that what we need here is another long expansion, which is the kind of thing we saw over the last, which is the record long expansion. We saw labor force participation rise. We saw wages persistently higher for people at the lower end, and there really was no obvious imbalance in the economy that threatened that expansion. It could have gone on for years were it not hit by the pandemic. So we'd love to find a way to get back to that. That's going to require price stability, and that's going to require the Fed to tighten interest rate policy and do our part in getting inflation back down to our 2% goal. So I mentioned two-sided risks. A couple things. One, the COVID is not over, and COVID can continue to evolve, and it's just we have to accept that it's not over, and the risks to it can slow down growth. And that's sort of a downside risk from a growth standpoint. I would point to another risk is just further problems in the supply chains, which could slow down activity. And you see the situation in China as a situation there where that's their no COVID policy may cause more lockdowns, is likely to, and that may play into more problems in supply chains. In addition, there's what's going on in Eastern Europe and things like that. So there's plenty of risk out there. And
ha citato anche l'Ucraina, cioè citali tutti, Jerome.
We can't forget that there are risks on both sides. So that's there. That's what I would say. I know you've been all over this issue with my colleagues, Craig, on the issue of information. We don't have that information at the board, and I asked the Inspector General to do an investigation, and that is out of my hands. I'm playing no role in it. I seek to play no role in it, and I can't help you here today on this issue, and I'm sorry I can't.
Ma ha detto che appunto che i rischi non se ne sono andati, il Covid c'è la Cina al no Covid policy, insomma, che chiudono tutti anche con 15 casi, c'è la tensione in Ucraina con la Russia, eccetera, eccetera. Insomma, Jerome è realista, non è Cioè, sta dicendo tutta la
Thanks for taking my
verità,
question, Chair Powell, and sorry for my tech issues.
sottolineando
I
le
wonder if you could
criticità.
tell us a little bit about where your thinking on inflation stands today. You know, the last time we saw an SEP back in September, we saw that you and your colleagues were projecting that inflation would sort of sink back down quite close to target by the end of the year. And I wonder if you still think that projection from December is a reasonable one, and if your thinking has changed at all, I wonder how you're...
Vabbè, gli chiede, pensi ancora della proiezione dell'inflazione? E lui dirà, ma sì, vediamo, non lo so, nel prossimo meeting faremo un nuovo Summary of Economic Projection.
thinking about that. And I also wonder if you could talk a little bit about the pathway to getting to that deceleration. Like how do we get from here, 7% CPI, to where you expect to be at the end of the year?
Okay.
So I'd say, since the December meeting, I would say that the inflation situation is about the same, but probably slightly worse.
Rispetto al meeting di dicembre, la situazione dell'inflazione è più o meno la stessa, ma un po' peggio. Jerome!
I'd be inclined to raise my own estimate of 2022 core PCE inflation. Let's just go with that by a few tenths today. But
lui alza la sua proiezione dell'inflazione a fine anno, ma la sua personale, non della Fed. Però, Jerome!
we're not writing down an SEP at this meeting, but I think it hasn't gotten better. It's probably gotten just a bit worse, and that's been the pattern. That's been the pattern.
Non è andata bene, è andata a little bit worse.
So I think if you look at the FOMC participants,
Nasdaq
there's a
0,5.
range there, and that range has been moving to the right for a year now. And by the way, if you look at other forecasters, essentially all other macro forecasters who do this for a living, you've seen the same pattern. So what do we think about that? Well, I think we wrote down rate increases in the December meetings, each of us individually, and I think to the extent the situation deteriorates further, our policy will have to address that. If it deteriorates meaningfully further, either in the time dimension or in the size of the inflation dimension. So that's how we're thinking about it. As I mentioned, though, I think part of this will be the Fed moving away from a very highly accommodative policy to a substantially less accommodative policy, and then over time to a policy that's not accommodative in time. I don't know when that will be. Those are the things that we're thinking about. That's part of it. Another part of it is that fiscal policy provided an impulse to growth over the last 2 years. That impulse will be less. In fact, will be negative this year. And so that's another thing. The other one is we will eventually get relief on the supply side, and the ports will be cleared up, and there will be semiconductors and things like that. Now, what we're learning is it's just taking much longer. So I think longer than expected, and that I think does raise the risk that high inflation will be more persistent. I do think we'll come off of the highs that we saw in the early part of this episode in the spring last year. But really, the question is going to be what is inflation running at, and so we'll be watching that. And our objective is to get inflation back down to 2%. It's also to provide enough support to keep the labor market healthy. The labor market is very, very strong right now, and I think that strength will continue. There's really a shortage of workers. We see it particularly among production and non-supervisory workers and people in the lowest quartile. You see very large wage increases. I mentioned some of the other indicators. So I think that's what we're looking at, and we're also, we realize, I think, as everyone does, that this outlook is quite uncertain, and that we're going to have to adapt, and we're going to communicate as clearly as we can, but we're going to have to be adaptable and move as appropriate.
Jerome, oggi ha deciso di essere ultra bear, sostanzialmente, magari ha shortato il mercato, no scherzo. No, ha detto appunto che l'inflazione sta peggiorando, che loro hanno il duplice obiettivo, cioè ha ricordato il loro duplice obiettivo, il mercato del lavoro è fortissimo, ha detto che mancano lavoratori, quindi non è preoccupato del mercato del lavoro, ma allo stesso tempo ha detto che faranno di tutto, sostanzialmente, per far tornare l'inflazione attorno al 2%. Sì, diciamo che è proprio ciò che i mercati... cioè è proprio ultra restrittivo nelle sue politiche monetarie, che da un punto di vista generale, cioè se uno guarda dall'alto della situazione di come vede l'economia statunitense nei prossimi 4 anni, questa è una cosa positiva, perché vuol dire che l'inflazione torna sotto controllo, i mercati, cioè l'economia cresce in maniera sana, ed è tutto più ok. Se uno guarda cosa succederà nel prossimo mese alle azioni, ops, e appunto, e a marzo ritornerà l'incertezza di quante volte rialzerà i tassi?
Thank you. Let's go to Colby Smith.
Thank you, Michelle. Chair Powell, when you talk about being humble and nimble about the path forward for monetary policy, does that also include the possibility of raising interest rates by larger increments and, say, doing a 50 basis points hike at some point if inflation does not moderate sufficiently? And should we interpret this approach as a departure from the gradual pace that we saw during the last hiking cycle?
So, as I mentioned, we have not made these decisions. We really haven't. And what I can tell you now, though, is that we fully appreciate that this is a different situation. if you look back to where we were in 2015, 16, 17, 18, when we were raising rates, inflation was very close to 2%, even below 2%. Unemployment was not at our estimates of natural rate, and growth was in the 2 to 3% range. Right now, we have inflation running substantially above 2%, and more persistently than we would like. We have growth even in forecasts, even in the somewhat reduced forecast for 2022. We still see growth substantially higher than what we estimate to be the potential growth rate. And we see a labor market where, by so many measures, it is historically tight. I think in a way, the least tight aspect of it is looking at the unemployment rate, which is still below our median estimate of maximum employment. If you look at things like quits and job openings, as I mentioned earlier, and wages, you're seeing, and just the ratio of job openings to unemployed, you're seeing a very, very tight labor market. Now, we also know that labor force participation is significantly lower. It's a percentage point and a half lower than it was in February of 2020. Maybe a percentage point of that is retirements. Some part of those retirements are related to COVID rather than just regular retirement. So we think there's a pool of people out there who could come back into the labor force. But it's not happening very quickly, and it may continue to not happen very quickly as long as the pandemic is on. So that's how we think about that. We haven't made, to your specific question, we really have not addressed those questions, and we'll begin to address them as we move into the March meeting and meetings after that.
Ok, un'altra domanda vuota, va bene? Però facciamo passare il
Let's
tempo,
go, Rachel.
ok? Magari i mercati riprendono un po'.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Chair Powell, for taking our questions. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about any metrics the Fed uses to assess how inflation affects different groups of Americans, especially lower income earners. And are you worried that the Fed underestimates or can't effectively measure the impact of inflation on some of the most vulnerable households? Thank you.
So it's more a matter of
Se la
I think the
Fed
problem
sottovaluta
that
l'inflazione
we're talking about here
per
is
le
really that
per le
people are on
persone,
fixed incomes who are living paycheck to paycheck.
ecco, che vivono
They're spending
mesi
most
mesi.
or all of their of what they're earning on food, gasoline, rent, heating, things like that, basic
Jerome,
necessities.
cosa stai per dire?
And so inflation right away forces people like that to make very difficult decisions. So that's really the point. I'm not aware of inflation literally falling more on different socioeconomic groups. That's not the point. The point is some people are just really prone to suffer more. I mean, for people who are economically well off, inflation isn't good. It's bad. High inflation is bad, but they're going to be able to continue to eat and keep their homes and drive their cars and things like that. It's more, so that's really how I think of it.
Sostanzialmente ha detto che lui vede che l'inflazione, cioè giustamente, che l'inflazione è molto problematica per chi comunque vive di mese in mese, da stipendio a stipendio. Se tutto ti si alza del 7%, ovviamente hai più fatica magari a concederti roba in più, magari hai più fatica a fare il pieno alla macchina, eccetera, eccetera. Mentre, certo, chi è ricco economicamente l'inflazione gli fa male, sì, però va bene, insomma, comunque non è che la sua vita peggiori drasticamente. Cioè, se tu vivi con $2.000 al mese è un conto, se tu vivi con $4.000 al mese, sì, ti peggiora la vita, ma insomma.
And we to control inflation for the benefit of all Americans. But part of it is just that it's particularly hard on people with fixed incomes and low incomes who spend most of their income on necessities, which are experiencing high inflation now.
Ok, Jerome?
Thank you. Let's go to Edward Lawrence.
No, comunque è molto realista.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for taking the question here. So year over year, inflation's at a 40-year high. The input costs for producer price index for all of 2021 was the highest on record. Some investors fear that the Fed might be moving too late. Now, you said no decisions were made on the path of rate hikes, but was a rate hike more than 25 basis points discussed today? And as a follow to that, because I have problems with the mute button, as a follow to that, you testified the supply chain issues could be worked out by the end of the year. You talked about that today. The CEO of Ford, though, told Fox Business today that the chip shortage will last into 2023. So today you said inflation will start to ease this year. I want to drill down and get a timeline that you see as to when we could see that relief. Thank you.
Mamma mia,
I would not say that I would expect the supply chain issues to be completely worked out by the end of this year. I do not expect them, and I have not expected them. What I would say, and I have been saying, is that I expect progress to be made in the second half of this year, mainly.
La supply chain non sarà
because we're not making
completamente
much progress. If you look at a ton of metrics, you can find some that suggest
Migliorerà, ma
that
non.
delivery times are shorter and inventories in some industries moving up. But overall, we're not making progress. And things like the semiconductor issue they're going to be quite a long time. I would think they'll go.
Ma basta dire che non stiamo facendo progressi, anche se è vero, fa male da sentire.
More than through 2023. In terms of being too late, I would just say this: our policy needs to be positioned to address the full range of plausible outcomes, as I said, and particularly the possibility that inflation will continue to run higher more persistently than we'd expected. And we think we are positioned to make the changes in our policy to do that, and we're committed to doing that. And that's really where we are. In terms of your question about the size of rate increases, we haven't faced those decisions. We haven't made them. It isn't possible to sit down here today and tell you with any confidence what the precise path will be. But as we work our way through this meeting by meeting, we are aware that this is a very different expansion, as I've said a couple times, with higher inflation, higher growth, a much stronger economy. And I think those differences are likely to be reflected in the policy that we implement.
Thank you. Let's go to Mike McKee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to sort of weave some of the strands of your answers together and ask you, as you start to reverse policy, what your goal is. Are you going to be raising interest rates until you get inflation to 2%? Do you want to go below 2% so that on average you get a 2% inflation rate?
Bella questa.
And because you said we have to protect the employment part of your mandate, is there some sort of circuit breaker that would stop you from raising interest rates on the employment side?
Ma gli hanno detto, visto che avete detto che l'inflazione volete cioè nella media al 2%, e finora era la scusa per dire, vabbè, è stata tanto tempo sotto al 2, facciamola andare un po' sopra al 2. Non è che la volete sotto al 2 così la media faccia 2, visto che adesso è decisamente sopra. Adesso sono curioso.
So no, there's nothing in our framework about having inflation run below 2%.
Okay.
So that we would do that, try to achieve that outcome. So the answer to that is no. What we're trying to do is keep inflation expectations well anchored at 2%. That's always the ultimate goal.
Comunque questa è una sottigliezza importante. Non gli interessa, cioè certo che gli interessa l'inflazione, ma quello che è l'obiettivo primario è di mantenere non esiste questa parola, però l'aspettazione dell'inflazione al 2%. Quello è importante, cioè quando vai in giro a una persona a chiedergli secondo te quanto sarà l'inflazione, lui vuole che la risposta sia 2%, che poi sia 2,5%, 1,8, 3, perché può variare di anno in anno, ok, ma se tu vai a chiedere a un americano qualsiasi cosa ti aspetti dell'inflazione tra 5 anni, la risposta deve essere 2%.
And we do that in the service of having inflation. We get to that goal by having inflation average 2% over time. And if inflation doesn't average 2% over time, then it's not clear why inflation expectations would be anchored at 2%. So that's the way we think about that.
Ha senso. Cioè l'inflazione media del 2% serve perché la gente vede che, ok, in media è 2%, quindi mi aspetto che sarà 2, poi appunto può essere 1,8, 2,2, insomma, eccetera, eccetera. Ha senso.
You know, what was the last part of your question?
No, Powell, ti sei
I
dimenticato
was
la
asking
domanda.
if you're protecting the employment side of the mandate, whether there's some sort of circuit breaker there.
Nothing like that. I mean, I would say you have a tremendously strong labor market, and you have growth this year at forecast to be well above potential. I mean, people are forecasting growth. If you think potential growth is around 2, most forecasts are significantly above that for 2022, and that's even with policy becoming substantially less accommodative. So the labor market is going to be strong for some time. Ideally, what we're trying to achieve is inflation getting back down to 2%, and we're trying to do that in a process that accomplishes, that will also leave the labor market in a very strong position. And no one really knows what that will take. Again, I would say that it isn't just monetary policy that's helping inflation get down. It'll be supply side improvements, and it'll be less fiscal impulse in all likelihood. So, but monetary policy will do our job. It is our job to get inflation down to 2%. And a situation where the two goals can be in tension is a difficult one. But I don't really think they are here, though, because I think a really significant threat to further strengthening in the labor market in the form of higher participation over time is high inflation. And also high inflation is taking away the benefits of some of these large wage increases that we're seeing now. So we do hope to achieve, and our plan is to achieve both of those goals.
Okay.
If I could follow up. Does the danger of tightening too much as policy works its way into the economy with a lag mean that you should go back to being more forecast dependent in making decisions rather than the state dependency you've been using as a framework for the last year and a half or so?
Dependency was particularly around the thought that if we saw a very strong labor market, we would wait to see actual inflation before we tightened. And so that was a very state-dependent thought because for a long time we'd been tightening on the expectation of high inflation, which never appeared. And that was the case for a number of years. So in this
Ha detto che hanno aspettato a restringere le politiche monetarie quando hanno visto inflazione, perché nel 2018 si aspettavano inflazione, hanno iniziato a stringere, poi l'inflazione non c'era e hanno detto what? Infatti nel 2018, fine 2018 hanno dovuto, o inizio 2019, hanno dovuto riabbassare i tassi perché l'inflazione non si era manifestata, loro si erano basati sulle aspettative che l'inflazione sarebbe arrivata, non è arrivata, e quindi hanno sbagliato. Adesso hanno aspettato di vedere l'inflazione per iniziare a stringere.
particular situation,
E
we will
continueranno a
be
attendere in questa
clearly monitoring
situazione,
incoming data as
di
well
vedere
as the
cosa
evolving
succede
outlook.
e poi agire.
Let's go to Michael Derby.
Thank you for taking my question. I want to ask you, with the benefit of hindsight, and I realize, I mean, that is what it is, but do you feel that, monetary policy and fiscal policy maybe did too much to react to the crisis, and that part of the inflation problem that we're having right now is because the government response, collectively was more than what the economy ended up needing?
Nasdaq meno 0,70.
So I think it's too
Doppio
soon to write that
2,5.
history, really. But what I would say is this. If you remember what it felt like at the beginning of the pandemic, literally the global economy shutting down in large part, including our own economy, and people going to their homes for weeks on end in masks, and there are no vaccines, and it could be a really long time to get them, and then you have economic activity drops by a shocking amount in one quarter. So there was a real risk of lasting damage. And I think Congress responded remarkably with the CARES Act, incredibly timely, very powerful. There'll always be flaws in these things, but in real time, it was a remarkable achievement. And we responded, and what we were able to do was, stave off a collapse of the financial system at the beginning and make time for what really needed to happen, which was the income replacement and then the recovery that Congress enabled with the CARES Act. So now that was a lot. And what we did was a lot. And now, what we have now is we have the strongest recovery of any country, and we have a recovery that looks completely unlike other recoveries that we've had because we put so much support behind the recovery. And we're managing the relatively high class problems that come with that, which are high inflation and a labor shortage. So, and these are serious problems, very serious problems that we're working as hard as we can on. Was it too much? Again, I'm going to leave that to the historians. But look, in 25 years, we'll look back at this incident, which will be a 2, 3, 4, 5 year period, and we'll say, we'll have a much better basis to make a judgment about the actions that people took. But it was all founded, though, in a very strong reaction
Vabbè, dai,
to
Jerome.
to
Falla
a unique
breve, che
historical event.
manca un po' che
I guess I'll have to
8
leave it at
minuti.
that. I hope I'll be around to see
Questa è
how
una domanda
that looks in 25 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Gene Young.
Thanks, Michelle. Chair Powell, some investors are expecting the yield curve could flatten or even invert after rate hikes begin. Would that worry you? And how important is that risk in the Fed's consideration for adjusting policy?
Questo è importante.
So we do monitor the slope of the yield curve, but we don't control the slope of the yield curve. Many factors influence longer-term interest rates. But it is something that we watch, and you will know that from when we had this issue a few years ago. And we take it into account along with many other financial conditions.
Beh, la curva dei rendimenti sostanzialmente è la differenza tra il rendimento dei decennali e i 2 anni. E ovviamente più è piatta, più c'è il rischio di recessione statisticamente, mentre dovrebbe essere, ovviamente, a 10 anni l'interesse dovrebbe essere più alto, perché stai rischiando per più tempo, i tuoi soldi li stai messo.
And as we try to assess the implications of all those conditions for the economic outlook. So that's one thing I would say. Another is currently you've got a slope, if you think about 2s to 10s, 2-year Treasury to 10-year Treasury, I think that's around 75 basis points. That's well within the range of a normal yield curve slope.
Okay.
So it's something we're monitoring. I don't think of it as some kind of an iron law, but we do look at it and try to understand the implications and what it's telling us. And it's one of many things that we monitor.
0,71 di differenza tra il 2 anni e il 10 anni.
Can I follow up real quick and ask if it did invert, would you tie it to U.S. fundamentals, or would it be driven by a much broader set of factors?
That's a good question in real time. Obviously, U.S. long-term sovereign debt is an important global asset, and the fact that our rates are so much higher than other risk-free sovereign rates around the world may put something of a ceiling on our rates. I don't know, but it would really depend on the facts and circumstances at that time.
Thank you. Let's go to Brian Chung for the last question.
Hi, Jerome Powell, Brian Chung, Yahoo Finance. Within the context of just the broad effort to normalize rates, would you describe what you want to do as a gradual hiking? And then secondly, within the context of hiking cycles, it's often the talking point for financial stability and wanting to make sure that asset bubbles don't merge. Is that something that has also factored into the conversation as you start to think about hiking rates? Thanks.
I would describe what we're doing along these lines. This is going to be a year in which we move steadily away from the very highly accommodative monetary policy that we put in place to deal with the economic effects of the pandemic.
Ok.
And that's going to involve a number of things. It's going to involve, and it does involve, finishing asset purchases. It's going to involve lifting off, and it's going to involve additional rate increases as appropriate. And we're going to write down in March our next assessment of what that might be. It's going to continue to evolve as the data evolve. We need to be quite adaptable, I think, in our understanding of this. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to have a couple more meetings, I think, to talk about allowing the balance sheet to begin to run off and do so in a predictable manner. And that's something that we will also be doing as appropriate. And I wouldn't, I don't think it's possible to say exactly how this is going to go. And we're going to need to be, as I've mentioned, nimble about this. And the economy is quite different this time. I've said this several times now. The economy is quite different. It's stronger. Inflation is higher. The labor market is much stronger than it was. And growth is above trend, even this year, let alone last year. So all of those things are going to go into our thinking as we make monetary policy.
Gli hanno chiesto come sarà l'anno, hanno detto, beh, aspettatevi un anno assolutamente non accomodante, perché cioè il fatto che la Fed sia stata accomodante per tutto il 2020 e il 2021, basta, è finita. Adesso finiamo gli asset purchases, cioè manca un mesetto e mezzo, poi alziamo i tassi, poi alziamo ulteriormente i tassi, cioè il lift off è portarli a 0,25, poi ne alziamo ulteriormente, poi piano piano ne faremo anche andare giù il bilancio, insomma sicuramente una politica monetaria restrittiva, non è più accomodante. Ovvio, ora resterà l'incertezza, probabilmente, cioè non dico per tutto l'anno, però sicuramente fino a marzo, di a che velocità.
And you asked about financial stability. Have concerns in connection with our policy. Was that your question?
Yeah, within the context of other hiking cycles, it seems like worries about asset bubbles emerging as a result of easy rates has been part of that. I didn't know if that was
Asset bubbles.
I would just say this. We of course have a financial stability framework. And what it shows is a number of positive aspects of financial stability. But you mentioned really asset prices is one of the four. So asset prices are somewhat elevated and they reflect a high risk appetite, and that's...
Continua a dirlo, basta Jerome! Ha detto che i prezzi degli asset sono somewhat elevated, cioè sono un pochino alti. Perché? Perché il risk appetite, cioè l'appetito al rischio, è alto. Nonostante questo crollo, Jerome?
Sort of thing.
Sì.
I don't really think asset prices themselves represent a significant threat to financial stability, and that's because households are in good shape financially than they have been. Businesses are in good shape financially.
Okay,
Defaults on business loans are low
grosso.
and that kind of thing. The banks are highly capitalized with high liquidity and
Le banche
quite
stanno bene, le
resilient
aziende stanno bene.
and strong. There are some concerns in the non-bank financial sector still around money market funds, although the SEC has made some very positive proposals there. And we also saw some things in the treasury market during the acute phase of the crisis, which we're looking at ways to address. But overall, the financial stability vulnerabilities are manageable. I would say.
Il financial risk è abbastanza contenuti. Va bene.
Thank you very
Questo
much.
ci sta. Però comunque dice che sono ancora sopravvalutati gli asset. È finita. Ma Powell, pensavo fino alle mezza. Invece è finita. Niente, è finita. Basta. Stop sharing, credo. Sono tornato solo io. Infatti il Nasdaq è tornato positivo. Perché? Perché ha finito di parlare Jerome. No, perché ha detto una cosa importante alla fine. Cioè, ha fatto tutto negatività. Tutto fa schifo. L'inflazione è sotto controllo. Non l'ha detto. Però, insomma, l'inflazione è alta. Dovremmo alzare non so quanto. Sicuramente c'è tanto spazio per alzare i tassi. Sicuramente inizieremo a diminuire il bilancio di tanto, eccetera, eccetera. Tutto super negativo. E poi alla fine se ne esce con... Vabbè, in realtà sì, gli asset sono sopravvalutati, ma va bene, non vediamo grossi rischi per la stabilità finanziaria. Cioè, anche se facciamo tutto questo, insomma, finanziariamente stiamo bene. Le persone, appunto, non sono indebitate, le aziende non sono indebitate, e le valutazioni delle aziende, sì, sono elevate, cioè, quindi azionario in particolare, però nulla di esageratamente preoccupante, e le banche sono capitalizzate. Quindi, ok. E questa è l'ultima notizia positiva che ha dato. Insomma, fa respirare i mercati, perché insomma il Nasdaq è passato da più 2,5 da quando hanno lasciato il report, perché c'era la paura che potessero già alzare i tassi adesso, non l'hanno fatto. Nasdaq a più 2,5, poi è iniziato a piano piano scendere, fino a meno 1 ha toccato, se non meno 1, meno 0,9 l'ho visto, o meno 0,8 insomma. E adesso ha recuperato, adesso è a 0, cioè adesso è proprio 0,00. Il Dow Jones è meno 0,73, anche lui era bello positivo, e l'S&P era sopra l'1%, adesso è meno 0,38. Cosa vuol dire questo? Ma vuol dire che il riassunto di tutta questa conferenza è che ci ha dato zero risposte. Nel senso, al momento non succede niente, è semplicemente rimandato tutto a marzo. Insomma, un'espressione in inglese interessante che traduco direttamente in italiano, semplicemente ha calciato la lattina per terra spostandola più avanti. Avete presente quando camminate, vedete qualcosa da calciare in giro e andare più avanti? Esatto, l'ha fatto. E quindi ha semplicemente posticipato tutte le domande per marzo. Adesso il Nasdaq è a più 0,2, insomma sta un pochino recuperando, però insomma diciamo che in questi 3 giorni sono stati molto volatili. Lunedì da meno 5 a più 0,6. Ieri più un po', cioè da meno 2 a quasi piatto, comunque con molta volatilità all'interno. Oggi da più 2,5 a meno 1 e adesso di nuovo verde. Tra mezz'ora vediamo come andrà a finire, sarò in live, anzi adesso appena mi stacco metto pubblica la live dopo, in cui parleremo principalmente della trimestrale Tesla che deve uscire tra mezz'ora, però appunto parliamo anche di quello che è successo ai mercati nell'ultima mezz'ora, eccetera, eccetera, di come vanno a chiudere le aziende. Vedo c'era molto più panico prima, ad esempio Matterport era arrivata a 9,30, adesso è 9,70, Enphase era a meno, Pinterest era a meno 6, è ancora a meno 6 senza nessun apparente motivo, insomma, vabbè, ha avuto un downgrade, capita. Facebook 2,95, Enphase 1,23, insomma, parleremo di tutto ciò tra 25 minuti, 20 minuti, metto la seconda live pubblica, vado a mangiare e appunto ci vediamo tra 20 minuti, rispondo a tutte le domande dopo, quindi il restante non l'ho fatto, comunque a tutta la domanda rispondo dopo, appunto ricollegatevi, rifatemele, parleremo ovviamente di Tesla ma anche di quello che ha detto Jerome Powell. Ci vediamo tra una ventina di minuti.